This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sarepti, aka Craig of the Acid Horizon podcast and also the Left Hand podcast. Now, for this episode, the first of 2026, I'm going to do something a little bit differently. Actually, I should say we're going to do something a little bit differently. And it also gives me a chance to introduce to you Emma Stamm as a contributor to Left Hand as we move into the new year. So, today is partly about getting to know Emma a bit more, how she thinks, what sort of philosophical trends she's tracking, where her sensibilities lie, but it's also about setting the tone for how we might be working together in the future. So rather than just a single one-off interview with Emma, we're going to go one for one through a shared set of questions about philosophy, public thought, media, politics, and the conditions under which thinking can happen or is happening right now. Emma is not just a guest here today. She's stepping into a co-hosting role on the podcast this year, and in many episodes, she'll be the one steering the conversation, such as one that we have coming up very soon with Aragorn Elof on microfascism and psychedelia. And so I should remind you before we start that this year also marks Emma's first course with the Acid Horizon Research Commons. Her upcoming course, Acid Communism, A World That Could Be Free, begins the first full week of January and engages questions of politics, desire, collective imagination, and the unfinished futures that continue to haunt the present. I will include a link in the show notes for those of you who want to learn more. And before we get to speaking with Emma today, I just want to say a few words about this podcast, its future, and bringing Emma aboard. Part of why I wanted to bring Emma here is that, well, one of the reasons, and I have to thank you for this, Emma, is that I have been stretched across a growing number of projects, and it felt both necessary and philosophically right to share the platform rather than consolidate it around my singular voice. But more than that, Emma was already working at the exact nexus this podcast has been approaching. She's somebody that I encountered in the Weird Studies philosophy sphere on their Discord server. And she's working, of course, in philosophy, politics. There's overlap with psychology, of course, the weird and esoteric, and of course, also the psychedelic, not as separate interests, but as overlapping problems that increasingly demand to be thought together. So what I'm hoping happens in this particular episode is that we conduct a kind of calibration exercise and also introduce Emma to the audience. It's going to be part interview, but hopefully it's more of a mutual orientation session and also a way to involve our listeners in a kind of green room discussion where we might be able to better shape what we do on the podcast. And so as you listen or after you listen, feel free to drop into the comments section in the Patreon or YouTube, wherever you are listening to this, and offer any feedback on any of the questions or topics that we cover here today. Emma, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. So I know when we had you on for the Mark Fisher meets James Hillman episode, which actually, I mean, typically I don't think in these terms, but, you know, as far as podcasting metrics and the success and viability of such endeavors is concerned, over the past year was actually one of our most successful episodes, certainly due in part to the topics, but also due to your treatment of them and the fun we had on that day. And then on that particular episode, you introduced yourself, but hopefully we can get an expanded introduction to you and your work here today. Maybe you could say a little bit about where you're coming from philosophically, how you started your path with respect to your research interests, and how did you get to where you are today?
Sure. Well, as a researcher, I'm most interested in presenting digitality. So everything that is rendered as digital data as a facade for political power. And that might seem very Foucauldian. I've drawn from Foucault for a number of years, but I'm also interested in more recent and applied theorizations. A really major influence on my thinking has been the late scholar David Columbia, whose book, The Cultural Logic of Computation, theorizes the digital in a very refined manner, like looking at specific applications without compromising on a theoretical lens. So trying to do both very fine-grained empirical and very robust theoretical research on the politics of digital technology. When I was working on my PhD, I was really interested in terms of describe digitality in terms of a material epistemology. So looking at how the formal attributes of data structures, algorithms, and encodings into binary determine in advance what gets authorized as knowledge. And then to zoom the lens out a bit, to explain why all of this is an essentially conservative program. And I took a sort of strange turn to use research on psychedelics as a way of talking about the conservative politics of digital epistemology. And that there's always going to be a part of me that's attracted to really technical topics. And I've done quite a bit of work in terms of understanding certain concepts in computer science pretty well. But these days, I'm more interested in the influence of the digital on perception. And the hypothesis I've been working with more recently is that immersion in digital media makes it harder to cognize and make mental contact with phenomena that can't really be rendered as structures and patterns. And I know that that's pretty abstract. So an applied example of that would be that I might say that the digital is hostile to the conditions under which we can cultivate and exercise negative capability, which was John Keats's term for a kind of insight that's only possible if we're not seeking answers that can be expressed in logical clauses and argumentation. Another way of talking about that is that the digital makes it hard to appreciate fictional narratives for anything that's not apparent on the surface as plot or formal characteristics. And that's where my head's been at a lot recently. But to step a bit further back to when I really began my career as a scholar, I've always been interested in the nexus between digital tech, epistemology, and politics. And I've looked at that through all sorts of lenses, and primarily drawing from critical theory and continental philosophy, but plenty of other disciplines as well.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons that I'm really happy to have you join us. And you'll probably join us for a few Acid Horizon episodes, including one upcoming with Anne Alembert on digital schizophrenia. Not that we have been blinkered to technology, but it's certainly something in the realm of what we do that I think needs to be amplified a bit more. What I'm interested in is how your expertise or research in that area will come into contact with some of the themes that we've already been exploring in terms of, I guess you would say, the way that the esoteric or the psychological or the concept of psyche intersects with philosophy and politics, and what that means, for example, as a potential intervention into the digital hegemony that we're all experiencing right now. Maybe you could just say a few words about that, especially, we've talked about this before, your interest in weird studies, for example. Where would you situate this more sort of ineffable dimension of consciousness, life, experience against the research that you've been pursuing over the past 10 years or more?
Well, one of the ways of thinking about the dangers of mass digitization that has been really important to me is to hold on to this idea that there is a dimension of knowledge that is altered when it becomes rendered in a certain form. I'll use the example from my dissertation, which is now almost 6 years old. There's something about the type of knowledge that's required to work with psychedelic substances medically that if we're trying to render this science in the same format that we might use to look at behavioral metrics and analytics and the sort of big data approach, that something there gets lost. And that's a fairly crude example, but the idea is that something is violated when it's put through that filter. And Certainly, the Weird Studies podcast has this project of epistemology that they may not put it in those terms, but if I can briefly speak on their behalf, I think they deal a lot with the idea that there's something like a radical mystery or a radical ineffable that we need to hang on to by realizing that we can't represent it in a form that's identical with its true inner core. And I'll just say the word inner core instead of ontology or epistemology, even though it's a little bit more loose. Epistemology, ontology, et cetera, might not quite capture this thing. So I've had some anxieties over the years because I don't want to be seen as simply railing against positivism or just sort of like pratfalling into negative theologies and like really only having something to say about the ineffable. So I can sort of hear all these voices in the back of my head that want to qualify and give more examples. But that would be the entry point into that conversation. And this actually brings to mind a question that I have for you, if you wouldn't.
Uh-oh.
and also
Go for it.
Relates to something that I've been thinking about a lot as I've been reflecting on this role with Left Hand. So not just in theory, but also in practice up until 2025, I've shied away from embracing the digital. Like my joke that I've had with friends this year is that this has been the first year that I've really been online because before I left academia, I didn't see any reason to put anything out there to really make an effort to be a presence on Twitter, for example, or on Substack, which I've been wading into this year. And that's because I always felt like something in my thinking would be altered if I started to think in those terms of becoming a bit more public. And so I wanted to ask you if thinking in public, thinking through all of these digital media have shaped your philosophical sensibilities or altered your psyche in any way.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the questions that we have in our little bucket here too, right? Well, I think the answer is yes, right off the bat, but it might be unsatisfying in some ways, which is, as far as philosophy podcasts go, Acid Horizon is relatively popular, and so it enjoys a pretty broad audience. Most episodes, I mean, like in the official podcast pipeline, get at least 10,000 listeners plus, and then, of course, YouTube and what have you. So every time you do an episode or every time you commit to doing like a monologue or something like that, your ideas are put in front of the ears of thousands. And so some ideas are more contentious than others, and of course are going to trigger or spawn different kinds of feedback. And I would say that by and large, maybe like a 60-40 split anyway, it's been positive. But I think people like who are just inclined to negative comments tend to speak out a bit more. But the more positive comments come in very concentrated and thoughtful ways. And I just wish, not that I wish to have more positive comments, of course I do, but I wish the negative comments were more thoughtful. And so in that sense, in terms of having a sort of dialectic with the audience, maybe I haven't received the adequate forms of correction in the forms of negative feedback that maybe you would get, let's say, from a thesis chair or a doctoral dissertation advisor or something like that. But the kinds of positive feedback that you get and the way that it's sort of shaped my sensibilities is that there are some people who have sent me very thoughtful emails saying how their lives have been transformed by the topics that they've covered. They would have never encountered something like this had they not heard us for the first time. And it's one of the things that kind of keeps me going. And often in those reflections, I get to hear the ways that people have been affected. And I think I lean into those things a bit more. That might happen for teachers who teach in an academic environment. And it certainly, even though I've had limited engagements in terms of teaching philosophy in the third dimension, as it were. When I taught in the prison system, I did. And I did a little bit of like critical thinking stuff when I taught intensive English language and writing programs and things like that. But, there is something very satisfying about that kind of positive feedback from students, listeners, or what have you, that tends to, I don't know, sort of plug up any holes of skepticism that have been shot into your hull from all the negativity that's been fired at you. But that said, too, I think another thing about the platform itself that lends to shaping one's philosophical sensibilities is because you have 10,000 plus people listening to you, and because you do have a very small, tight cohort of not only co-hosts, but regular guests, there's a sense of accountability that develops over time, not only to those people, but to yourself. And while I've had that sense of accountability develop in a real-time, three-dimensional environment in the philosophy classroom, it could be because I am most of the time in a central role as the host, but I feel that pressure much more. But now, after having done it for so long, not that I've developed a callus for it, but that pressure has just become a kind of fact of life in some sense. And so not only do my philosophical reflections, research interests, positions, opinions, and so forth, not only are they put in the crucible when it comes to me interacting with, let's say, like I said, a thesis chair or something like that, there are more determinants, I would say, sort of impacting the brew, the alchemical brew that is my philosophy. So I don't know. How about you? I mean, you've had limited contact with this sphere, but what is it that you expect that you'll get from making this entry into the para-academic world versus having taught in a university setting?
So between 2021 and 2024, my work consisted almost entirely, about 80% of my working hours were spent doing something related to teaching. Either I was in the classroom, or I was prepping my classes, or I was grading. The other 20% of the time I was doing administration. One of the sadnesses for me in the academic positions that I was able to get post-PhD is that none of them came with much support for research in terms of my workload and the hours that I would have been able to put into publications, or a budget to do research, that kind of thing. And I mention that because then what happened is that my way of thinking about doing philosophy was profoundly shaped by spending so much time with students, with undergraduates in particular, like typically people between the ages of 18 and 22. And so I would either be alone with my thoughts, alone with ideas for a new paper or a book project that has been in progress now for a very, very long time. And the only form of feedback that I was getting was from people who had no prior exposure for the most part, because I was teaching undergraduates typically in required courses, or maybe were coming in with a little bit of interest, but in any event, they weren't prepared to be able to give me good substantive feedback. So I didn't really have accountability mechanisms after going through the gauntlet that is the PhD, where you're scrutinized very hard by your committee. And I think that actually led me to go so far into my own thinking and so far inward that throughout this year, now we're right at the end of 2025, as I've been trying to go a little bit more public, I've had the good fortune of having some testing mechanisms. I've done a lot of sort of one-off speaking events in person here in New York City, and I've had a very diverse audience of people interested in philosophy, from academics to techies to people who have jobs completely unrelated to anything, that they're just interested, giving me feedback about what they particularly connected with, what they didn't understand, and all of that. And more now than ever before in my career, I'm beginning to see the value of having so much feedback of so many different sorts, and being public. It's not just good in the sense that it can move your career along, but it can actually sort of help you get clearer on what you're really doing as a scholar. And I think that the anxiety that comes with having to think in public, if you will, that can actually kind of be a little bit of a good thing. Reflecting on my academic experience, I was kept in a silo. I think a lot of academics were. I didn't have anybody on my committee, or really anybody in my community at all, who would have been presenting a framework that said, maybe the French theorists aren't all that there is, or maybe the Frankfurt School isn't all that there is. So Even though I still claim certain traditions as my home base, it's kind of nice to have a strong incentive to speak to people who may come at that a bit more critically.
Yeah, I have a few things to say about that in response too. And I might have said this on Acid Horizon at some point, or maybe in one of our patrons only discussions, but I had a very sort of split experience when it came to my experience as an undergrad and then later as a master's student at Cal State LA. I got my undergrad at Penn State University, but I was an undergrad in the mid to late 1990s. And I just had the absolute fortuitous benefit of landing in a program because that's a state university. So I went to the university that was in my state. I wanted to do philosophy. I had a very vague notion of what it was that I wanted to do. I had read a little bit of Nietzsche, I think, some Freud. I didn't even know what the continental tradition was when I entered into college for the first time. And so it was by chance that I landed into a program that at the time was focusing on phenomenology. At the time, Derrida was in vogue, and at Penn State in particular, Heidegger was big, and Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, existentialist, sort of the tail end of the existentialist tradition morphing into 90s phenomenology, left Heideggerianism, if you want to call it that. And I also studied a fair amount of Asian philosophy at the time. I don't think necessarily that the content mattered as much as the form of my experience, which was, well, I just had great teachers who were available to me and would often allow me just not only to come into their office hours, but just like if they saw me going down the hall, just pull me in. And we would have discussions that today, by some standard, would be deemed a sort of luxury. Just a personal interaction with the teacher, maybe in a lamplit room, no fluorescent lights, it seems like a living room, and just musing on philosophical topics. And it left a profound impression upon me because in those moments, in this sort of like philosophically idyllic way, time had slowed down. It was the luxury of the conversation of philosophy. Then I lived overseas. I went to work for about 10 years. And then there was a point at which it's like, maybe I'll try to get my master's in philosophy because I was already working at a university. I had my master's in education and I was teaching, and it was possible for me at that time to take classes for free. And so I thought, all right, let's try philosophy again, with the expectation that I would once again be immersed in the magic of that world. And it was very different. It seemed much more mechanical. The teachers seemed more stressed. It seemed like a meat grinder. The advising was terrible overall. And I have to invoke the concept of Fred Moten's The Undercommons, because really the only way that that experience was fully enjoyable was to have found friends and comrades who were interested in the topics that I was interested in, which were not part of the department hegemony, and then having conversations in the library with a very limited subset of professors, really just one, a couple of grad students, and many undergrads. And it almost felt like we were, I don't know, in an underground lair when we were having these discussions, rather than on the top floor or playing piano on the mezzanine or something like that, out in the open where I believed philosophy was happening in academia. Like, we had to find a space within this already intensely striated environment. And so I was quickly disillusioned. And I could say a lot more negative things, and I think I have on previous episodes about that experience. Some of the teachers are great overall, but as an institutional encounter, it was a travesty. And I was not yet fully disillusioned. I think the impression that I had gotten when I was a younger student had lingered with me for so long that that negative experience could not immediately erase that. So yeah, it took, I think, maybe one of the ways doing public philosophy has sort of influenced my philosophical sensibilities is that I've been able to compare the joys of creating a podcast that has, achieved its own sort of success, whilst watching friends and comrades online speak of the misery of undergoing their doctoral programs, funding being drained away, and watching the institution of the university just, of course, it's utterly compromised by corporate interests, but also it's been undone by practices that it itself has internalized. And I'm talking about philosophical departments and its inability to resist the ongoing incessant changes that are transforming the humanities in the university. And in seeing that, and this is going to sound like an advertisement for the Asset Horizon Research Commons, over time it made me think, well, what we're doing here, like even just in a podcast format and reading groups and the little collective that we've created, this is far more nourishing intellectually and community-wise than anything else that's available right now. Because what I experienced in 1997 is gone forever. And so this seems like the new up-and-coming paradigm. And at any moment, as I said, when I had doubts or mild skepticism about continuing doing this, inevitably somebody from the outside would send some sort of email saying how much what Asset Horizon has done or Left Hand has done has impacted the way that they've thought. So that's why I do what I do. And I guess it's my turn to ask you a question. Let's see. We have this little grab bag of questions. Here's kind of a fun one.
Can I make a quick reply?
Sure. Yeah.
I think more than any other discipline, the way that people first encounter philosophy has a huge determining influence on their thinking about it for the rest of their lives. One thing you hear a lot if you're a philosophy professor, as I was for a few years, you tell people what your job is when they ask, and they say, oh yeah, I was sort of interested in philosophy when I was younger, or I even majored in philosophy as an undergrad. And usually in these conversations, I'd be speaking with an American, and I would just be hearing kind of a tone in their voice that said, you know, I kind of like been there, done that. I had my little magic moment with it for a few years. And then I kind of got over it and got back down to earth and did something more practical. And I always wanted to say, if you were in a typical American philosophy program, chances are you were exposed more to analytic or pragmatist philosophy and maybe absorbed some notion of what philosophy is. That, to me, it's much less exciting than so many of the other traditions. And sort of related to that, a lot of the philosophy courses that I took as an undergrad were just really uninspiring. I loved a lot of them, and many others I really disliked and came close to majoring in it, but didn't ultimately for that reason, because there were just too many encounters with the thin version of it that treats philosophy as a science, or professors that seemed very, very defensive about doing philosophy, which I think is a problem that we see especially in the Anglophone world. But in any event, on the para-academic conversation and conversation about doing philosophy publicly through podcasts and in online spaces, I am quite optimistic about the possibility for these spaces to cultivate a really good experience, and in particular, a really good introduction or maybe reintroduction for people, so that they realize that this is something that you can grow with and that can be a part of your life, like through your whole life, that it doesn't just have to be like a few years when you're 19 to the age of 21 or something like that. Because it took me a long time to get to that point where I saw it like that. And my involvement in these spaces is so much about wanting to create that ideal experience for others.
Yeah, that makes me think too, I told you about my experience at Penn State University, but actually I went to community college for 2 years prior to entering what is the main campus at Penn State, just trying to rack up gen ed credits before going on to my major. However, at the community college, I had a fantastic experience with a philosophy professor who was essentially, he was an Aristotelian, I think, with some Kantian leanings, I would say, but he was also an Eastern Orthodox minister. And even though I don't know if they had this term coined at the time, but he was kind of like a death doula as well. And so a lot of his stories had to do with people that he encountered while they were dying, or sentiments they had while they had some sort of terminal illness. And so my introduction to philosophy had the feel of like, this is a life or death matter attached to it. This is not merely about propositions, validity, soundness, although that was there and that's important stuff. But I felt that that was much better. I remember he was a Ukrainian, and one of the things that I'll just never forget about that class was he said that he had an uncle whose dream was to die a quick death. I just want to get gunned down in a limo or something like that. Maybe he was in the mob or something. Like that was the suggestion, but it made me think that, all right, I'm entering into this adult life. Here are some folks' values about living and dying. And this professor, I think I said his name, Joseph Woodill was his name, put forward this panoply of figures that was absolutely inspiring and made me want to continue, because I was on the fence at that time. Should I go the direction of studying Freudian psychology, or should I go headlong into philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, having a sense of life attached to those early encounters with philosophy, I think, is really important. At Villanova, where I was a visiting professor in their philosophy department for a few years, I became friends with a professor there who was a medical ethicist, an applied medical ethicist. And he had all sorts of stories about working as a medical ethicist on call at a hospital, and sometimes literally getting calls late at night to help them make decisions that came down to life or death. They had an ethicist on call. His stories were really wild. But I remember just hearing a few of them from him and speaking with him about what that was like and how that was different from the more academic side of his career, and thinking, this has got to be so powerful for students. And I think even if you're not a death doula or a minister or a medical ethicist on call at a hospital, and even if you were to reject the idea that you need to be applying, I'm making scare quotes around this on camera, but if you reject the idea that you need to do quote unquote applied research, because I think that there is something actually sort of oddly conservative about that. The idea that you have to, quote unquote, apply your research. It's still important as a philosophy educator to infuse your teachings with a sense of real stakes, even if you're not tying them directly to one applied case or another. There's a way of sort of subtly conveying or implying that this is not about the words in the front of your mind all the time. It's not about the perfection of a logical argument. Even if you're an atheist, I think you can still say that there is some kind of spiritual dimension to this. And I think that's important for people to have, especially as they begin their journey with philosophy. There's a reason that, in a sense, all human beings are philosophers. Everybody is asking really big questions. It's just kind of a natural thing that goes very far beyond what is, to some people, just sort of a meaningless exercise in abstractions.
I think ultimately my experience with philosophy cleaves to a certain truth about the discipline itself, which is that there are life or death stakes, and that if somebody does have an antipathy towards the idea of philosophy, my guess is that it's going to introduce them to those stakes. And that's what's absolutely frightening about it. But maybe we'll move on to another question. Do you find yourself operating with a philosophical mantra or methodological orientation right now? Something that subtly governs how you read, write, and engage in, even if it's not explicitly stated within your work?
Sure. I did not realize until maybe just a year or two ago that some people don't think of philosophy as creative. For me, it was always self-evident that this is not very different from creative writing, from composing music, from any practice that I consider creative. Philosophy, I haven't put it in exactly the same lane as the arts, but even before I read a single word of Deleuze, I had it in my mind that philosophy is about creation. And of course, I'm referring to his famous notion that philosophy is about the creation of concepts. And I think working with that assumption gave me the freedom to put my mind into some pretty far out spaces and to think very synthetically at an age that, I think I was a little bit younger when I was trying to do that kind of thinking than some of my peers. And I suppose that sounds a little bit judgmental. I also had other things that I had to spend a lot of time catching up on. Maybe the more sort of quote unquote left brain side of philosophy came a little bit later for me than for some people. But the idea that you could sort of think of philosophy as an infinite canvas for painting on made it a lot easier for me to generate ideas and to pursue lines of thought that I think some people might have denied themselves up until they maybe got their PhD or had a few more years in the bank. And with that sense of freedom, I think I found the fuel to sustain me for, at this point, over 15 years in the discipline of philosophy. The other thing that I would say to this is that I have tried very hard this year, as I mentioned earlier, stepping back from traditional teaching, doing more writing for the general public and more writing in general than I had been able to do for the few years prior. The mantra has been to stop over-explaining and stop signposting my thinking excessively, because I got into the habit of doing that while teaching undergrads and while I was a graduate student. So writing essays in such a way that they could easily accommodate subheadings, like very point by point, writing in such a way that everything accommodated summarization, distillation. And what happens when you do that is that you lose a certain, I think, literary sensibility as a thinker and a writer. And there's a certain sort of dimension of nuance. And I love the concept of negative capability. So I'll come back to that again. You kind of lose your negative capability muscles when you're thinking in terms of just being able to break down everything into these little digestible formats, which is what you do when you are teaching a lot, or when you're in the habit of having to constantly be defending a chapter, a piece of writing to a bunch of academic critics from, in my case, a wide range of disciplines. So I've let myself trust my audience more to follow my thinking. And the feedback that I've gotten this year, as I've been doing these one-off lectures in public and a little bit of this para-academic teaching just in one-off events online, is that I tend to over-explain myself, and that I probably should not be so anxious about people understanding what I'm saying. So I've been just allowing myself to not care quite so much if I'm intelligible, if I'm making sense. And I think that that's given my work a little bit more refinement.
Well, in the podcast format, that's easy to remedy. We'll just delete the parts after the fact where you think you've explained too much. I think my response to your response to the question is going to resonate at the level of the way that philosophy sort of interacts with a sort of self-conscious tendency that I have. So one should always ask, like, what was it that really made you turn to philosophy itself? Maybe for some people, it's actually picking up a philosophy book and the journey begins there. In my case, I'd like to think that there were some dark precursors, as it were, some quasi-philosophical experiences that were embedded within moments of turning inward that may have even come about as a result of feeling sad, hurt, depressed, shocked, or what have you. And at the time, not having the awareness or tools to identify exactly what was happening. And only later in life, seeing that once you've developed your philosophical toolkit, being able to look back and say, that's what happened there. Certainly, it was a kind of negativity that turned me to philosophy, to start asking questions and maybe even questioning my own power or vitality. There's definitely a sort of masculinist element to why me as a man turned to philosophy. Maybe it was because I broke up with my first girlfriend or something. Like that might have been one of the moments that sort of pushed me there. It was a place for me to kind of lick my wounds, as it were. But I would say also it was at that time, perhaps, that I engendered some of the negativity that folks like Nietzsche and Deleuze point out as being the motor of certain philosophical thought. And once I encountered philosophy in its proper sense, and having a teacher who was exceptional at teaching Nietzsche to me for the first time, showed me why it was I turned to philosophy and showed me how that negativity sort of was inhabiting that kernel of interest that was growing at the time, and then immediately turning it back on me and resonating with what you were saying, showing me how philosophy is not only this sort of way to brood or mull over one's injuries, but it is this creative discipline. And then also seeing how within the discipline itself, like if we look at the image of thought that Deleuze critiques, seeing how that negativity manifests in the form of concepts, in the form of presuppositions and so forth, and developing a methodology that allows us to sort of route those things out. And I would say, like, amongst the many sort of creative endeavors that I've had in my life, whether it was those meager attempts at writing poetry or the attempts at learning graphic design and things like that, philosophy was among those creative endeavors. But there was something about philosophy itself that allowed me to stage this encounter between this sort of negative image of myself and the creative version of myself. As I went through life and as I got more involved in philosophy, and then especially reading chapter 3 of Difference and Repetition on the image of thought, that had such a profound effect on me and gave me the tools to look critically at not only the beliefs of particular philosophers, but the actual presuppositions with which I approach particular philosophical problems. Even things like, just when I think about dreaming and the ineffability of our experience, or how is it that we can internalize or possess the very richness of the cosmos or understand it without deferring to a notion underpinned by lack or negativity. These are all sort of little encounters or sort of little skirmishes within the soul that I've had through my own personal journey with philosophy. But all that to say that secretly, I have been a negativity smuggler. It gets smuggled into my thought here and there. And I find that philosophy has, and the particular kinds of philosophy that I'm interested in, have been apt tools to kind of route that out, interrogate it, investigate it, and then incorporate those resistances or resentments and transfigure them in a way that made life worth living more, or to be fully present to a conflict, or to admit shame or guilt and transfigure it. So I would say that that particular philosophical mantra is what, has been a sort of consistent thread in my own philosophy throughout my life.
A lot of what you just said strikes a chord with me when I think about my very earliest wanderings into philosophy as a teenager. The biggest motivator probably was that I suffered from very severe depression as a young person, not garden variety teen angst, but to the point where I temporarily had to leave school. I was hospitalized. It was very, very disabling, and a few other conditions that surrounded that. But primarily just once I was about 12 years old, maybe 13, it was like this dark cloud had just settled over my life. And what was interesting philosophically, although I certainly didn't have this framework back then, was that I couldn't understand what was happening. This was well before the discourse that we now have around mental health, where today's young people seem very well versed in diagnoses. I didn't know anybody else who was dealing with that condition, so it was very isolating. I felt acutely a separation between mind and world. What was going on mind was so different from what was happening in the world. And there was no clear precipitant either. So there was no real reason. It's not like I had undergone a particular trauma. So I had to grapple with my own mind and my own negativity on its own terms. And I really had to sit with the idea that the mind is a very, very powerful force. It's not that we all inhabit one shared reality, but the mind will determine your experience, or the mind will maybe pick up on things in ways that other minds don't. And it wasn't until I started reading different kinds of philosophy. One of my first introductions was actually through the study of Zen Buddhism, which I got into at a fairly young age. But as soon as I was in undergrad, reading more Western philosophy, it really helped me make sense of some of these very extreme experiences. And when I really began to make contact with philosophy as a creative discipline, when I started writing basically and having professors respond positively to my writings and my contributions in class, I really saw it as a methodology for sort of like processing and getting out maybe ineffable precursors as what we would then call concepts that maybe other people can enter into as well and begin to feel a little bit less alone and see different parts of themselves, different parts of the way that they experience the world as something that is a positive, to put that word in the crudest possible sense, a positive part of being human, a very valid and very rich part of being human. But if I hadn't had those texts, if I hadn't had those professors and this outlet, it would have been a lot harder for me, I think, to just kind of move forward in life, seeing myself as somebody who was a low serotonin person, inclined toward negativity, and also just a weirdo. Like for me, it wasn't so much about gender, but I always felt like I was just a very, very strange person. And then reading a lot of philosophy made me realize like there are a bunch of other really strange people like me, and this can actually be a way that we affirm something together. And I think that's also part of why I'm so adamant about creating these spaces for other people, because it's something that has been just so profoundly important for me now, going on 20 some odd years.
I think the mind-body split thing is a big one for many of us. Our traumas and other forms of alienation that we experience exacerbate that tendency to split mind and body. And then it's a liberating, but maybe also a tough day existentially when you realize you are not in a body, you are the body. You are the body. And once you get to that point of understanding that you are the body, then it's time to get in the body, where philosophy can be one amongst many things that can help you with that embodying process, at least the forms of philosophy that I think that we both kind of enjoy. Let's go to another question. Oh, wait, it's your turn to pick, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. So I am very curious to know how your creative practices beyond the work of theory and philosophy interface with your work as a scholar. So you're a musician, you do graphic design work. What are the connections there, if any?
All right. I know that Quentin Tarantino is a reviled figure in social media right now. And I forget what movie it is. It's not Death Proof. It's the other one where the woman has the M16 for a leg. I can't remember the name of the film. But in that film, there's a line that sort of rings true with the integration of my creative practices, which is there's going to be a moment in your life where all of the little things that you've learned will come together in a single moment, and you will get to use everything you learned at once in one moment. And that moment has been the past 5 to 6 years, actually. And so, I mean, of course, nobody in 1983 or whatever it was when I was like 4 or 5 years old ever said they wanted to be a podcaster, let alone a philosopher. Like that was never part of the plan back then. I probably wanted to be a paleontologist at that time. But I will say that there was a sort of distinct moment where I realized like, oh shit, I have actually all of the skills required to make a podcast. So I had spent about 10 years in a progressive metal band. And part of the learning curve of being in a band was learning Pro Tools on the Digi-O2 back when that was like the sort of like industry standard, which was just by today's standards, a horrible audio converter. And then, of course, working on those slow MacBooks at the time, it allowed me to cultivate a kind of grit and tolerance for timeline editing, which not only takes know-how, but it takes a lot of patience to learn those sorts of things. So just being like learning timeline editing at a time when it was not popular. So there was that. When I was younger, actually, I did flirt with the idea of being a radio announcer or DJ or something like that. I always loved the radio. I loved winning prizes too. So like Be the 10th Caller, I was there. I did that a lot. I think I was flagged as a prize pig, as they called it back in the day once. And maybe I was banned from winning prizes for a while because I definitely had the local radio stations on memory dial. So there's that piece. Then there's also the design piece. When I was younger, I was always a pretty proficient drawer, painter type. But then I put that down for many years and got into computers and stuff. Actually, I was one of the first kids on my block, despite the fact that my family were working class, whereas most of our neighbors were like kind of middle class. I did have a computer at a young age, and I had the precursor to AOL, which was Prodigy. I don't know if you remember the Prodigy interface, but basically dial up. I don't even know if it was a 56K modem. It might have been like 14.4 or something like that, but just message boards. And so I was online in 1990, right? So maybe even 1989, now that I think about it. Anyway, all of those pieces kind of came together. And then, of course, after my stint in the band, I started just making kind of lo-fi ambient music and that sort of thing. And I just started compiling tracks, just recording. I'd go home, make one over a period of 1 to 3 nights and just dump it in a folder. All of this is important. I'm going somewhere with this. So imagine I have this many years of experience. I'm doing philosophy. I can do the timeline editing and everything else besides. And then the pandemic hits. And of course, we start the podcast. And I know you were asking, like when we talked about doing this episode prior to signing in today, you referenced like Crit Drip, all of the designs that I created. All of that came out of, it was a response to the pandemic. It was a kind of manic response to the pandemic that I sat at my computer for hours a day, sometimes with a Zoom call with my place of work on in the background while I'm just designing philosophy-inspired designs. And just to show you how manic I was about it, I think I have like 520 designs in my store. Like I would do 3 a day or 4 a day. And I was just doing it for fun. So all of that just sort of built up in a very, the skill set built up over a number of years. Like some of the necessary features of the podcast, like the music and the design and everything, all came together in a very short amount of time. I also realized too, as a listener of podcasts, that there was a kind of gap, or at least I didn't find a podcast that was like Acid Horizon. I didn't find one to my satisfaction anyway. One that was produced with a high level of audio quality and also that kind of had vibes, that had like kind of cool music. So I wanted to put in some of the ambient music tracks that I created. And then, all right, let's talk about Mark Fisher, Baudrillard, and all these figures that I've immersed myself in over the past 20 plus years or so, and let's give it a go. And so all of that, I think, mushroomed pretty quickly when we had a rapt audience during the early days of the pandemic, where everyone was just online and a new podcast came out, and that was Acid Horizon, and we were able to draw our audience then. So it was fortuitous in the sense that it was a reaction to an ongoing global catastrophe, and the community was basically waiting right there because nobody could go outside. You were stuck with Acid Horizon, at least some of us were, for 3 months or 4 months or whatever it was. But yeah, that's how that came about.
That's interesting to hear all of that, but especially the way that you got into doing the design work for Crit Drip, as you said, it was sort of a reaction to the pandemic, and you'd be sitting at home just churning out one after the other. This was a very different case, but it reminds me of the way that I used to make music and a connection that I could draw to philosophy as a practice. I had to put my music life on hold indefinitely once I started my PhD, and I'm just beginning to climb out of that hole. But before then, for a number of years in my 20s, I would come home every day after work or after my master's degree courses and just play my piano for hours and hours, my digital piano, because I was going through a lot of different things. And it felt like the only outlet that I had to really process reality effectively. And as some context for that, I really wanted to get an advanced degree in a humanities discipline right out of undergrad. I didn't end up doing that because I had been told if I went that route that I would be in poverty for the rest of my life. So instead, I got my master's degree in nonprofit management. Really did not like management school. Felt like I was just an odd fit in that world and was feeling sort of bleak about my professional future. I'd been told actually very specifically that because I'm not fluent in German or French, that any dream that I had to go on to study philosophy or theory was just a total pipe dream. So I would go home late at night and I made just a ton of music. And I also then taught myself a little bit about production. And I just did it because I did it. I didn't have any goals for it. I wasn't making any money that way. I had played in bands a little bit left and right here and there. But it wasn't entirely different from the way that I was still, even at that point, reading Adorno, reading Baudrillard, even though there was no practical use for it whatsoever. It was a way of kind of just handling my life. And I came to see it ultimately as I then decided to take the risk and pursue a scholarly career. I saw it as a kind of like antagonist muscle training where doing the more analytic, fine-grained work of theorizing and reading texts with the idea that I'd have to write about them at a professional level, being able to then go to the piano and just work things out completely in sound instead of in concepts, kind of made it so that I never lost contact with what we might call a more intuitive part of myself that I think then actually made my writing a little bit stronger so that it wasn't just one dimensional. And I still see it that way. So I kind of, on one level, I like to think of them as very different, but having different creative practices, I think they keep different creative and cognitive muscles going, and they actually end up having a positive effect on all of the different things.
We've lived parallel lives actually in more than one way then, because I mean, I did my 10 years with the band, but I also had this, I guess you would say, at the time I didn't think of it this way, but it was a ritual practice, which was open something like Ableton Live. But even before I had that, I had like Acid. Whoa, there's a connection, Acid 3.0. So that was the name of the program by Sony. So where you just made music with loops. And so what I would do is I'd open up an 8-bar loop, maybe just throw some drums in and do some lo-fi hip hop. I did that for a while. I probably have like 2 albums worth of lo-fi hip hop beats just on a CD-ROM somewhere. But also the same with ambient music. And I would say that was an antidote to the kind of alienation that I had felt working the sort of call center bank jobs. I was working doing corporate banking in the bilingual call center for a Japanese bank for a while. And I would come home and, like I said, you open up Ableton, you get the 8-bar loop going. And the metaphor that's coming up for me right now is like a digital rosary in a way. I would just go over and over that loop again. It had this sort of palliative effect. And one of the unintended side effects of that was developing this incredible tenacity to just sit down at the computer and edit music. And so like that kind of folds back into doing the podcasting. So that's interesting. But also like you too, I had set aside any notion of doing anything with philosophy in favor of doing something practical, which was I got my master's in education. And that's what allowed me then to teach at the college level. I had a certificate in teaching ESL and things like that as well. And granted, I think that concession in its time was a necessary one for being able to do the things that I'm doing now. And it also allowed me, I think, to transition from the absolute state of dread and existential destitution that I was feeling in my previous job, and then teaching young students, growing a sense of accountability for them, becoming confident in my public speaking voice, I guess you would say. But that was a sort of stepping stone or trial then to, later, having the luxury of getting a master's degree in philosophy. But then, like I said, building a kind of ethos, a kind of personal credibility to myself. Like, I'm able to do this, and I'm able to do it in a way that's satisfying, or at least not embarrassing to me, to present myself as a teacher of a particular content, whether it was Shakespeare's Hamlet or Ozymandias, the poem, or something like that. But also feeling as if I betrayed some part of myself. And so this goes hand in hand with my interest in the Ariadne myth. Ariadne gets with Theseus, but in doing so, she betrays her divine birthright to be with the heroic mortal, but she's burdened by him. And ultimately, Theseus betrays Ariadne. But that is a precursor to her then marrying Dionysus, right? Through which she's transformed. So I never considered it that way, but that was a sort of Ariadnic, I don't know, Dionysian threshold that I did cross myself in my life, and then brought me to a place where the prospect of professional philosophy was possible. But even that seemed dead on arrival once I was in the master's program. I'm looking around, I'm like, I might be able to teach at a community college. In fact, the graduate advisor said to us, very pessimistic, I mean, essentially a realist of sorts. He said, the reason that you're all here today, first of all, they didn't want us to write a thesis. They just wanted us to do comps. That's a totally different story. But he said that most of you, at most, will move on to teaching 1 or 2 classes a semester at a community college, probably intro to philosophy, maybe symbolic logic, something like that. I mean, at the end of the day, for me, boring as shit. Not saying that I'm bigger than that, but I don't want to do that. That's not what I want to do. But it also is disconcerting that in that context, given that many of us were not moving on to a PhD, there was a kind of ceiling placed right above us, right there in that moment. Maybe we'll do one more question. Oh, I wanted to see what your answer was to this. It's about the attention economy. And I'll just preface it by saying, like, look, I know podcasting exists within the attention economy, and there is a critique of the podcast form just lying in wait. And I know what it is. I know all the critiques, in fact, because I'm self-critiquing. But the question is, where do you think the line is between productive provocation and provocation that simply generates noise, philosophically, I guess, or otherwise, academically? And how do you tell the difference when listening or participating in the attention economy, like when you hear something that's philosophically provocative, and the kind of provocation that might be productive of creating the new, let's say?
Well, there will always be provocateurs, people who provoke simply for the effects of provoking. And I think that falls pretty far beyond the remit of your question. But I suppose I'm speaking about trolls and just people who make noise on the internet. And I do my best to ignore those people, as I think all wise people do.
I'm not wise. Actually, I've gotten a lot better about reacting.
Yeah, I'm not always wise either, especially as I get more and more online. I think that intention matters. I think that you have to be aware of where you're coming from as a commenter, whether you're responding to somebody's posts online or you're a host or guest on a podcast. It's an exercise in self-awareness, as I know very, very well. The reason it can be hard to distinguish where productive provocation ends and noise-generating provocation begins is that as nice as it would be to think that we're only speaking for the value of the ideas that we're articulating, the truth is that when you're thinking in public in this manner, a lot of what people are connecting with, and I think a lot of what distinguishes it from other formats, is that there is some kind of personal connection to it. There's a hope that you're not just expressing an idea, but that you're also expressing yourself, and that what people connect with goes beyond the argument and goes to the way that you as an individual are conceptualizing it and then maybe the personal stakes that you have in it. It's folk wisdom of content production, and there's a lot to be critiqued about this, but the truth is that for anybody who gains a following or is able to make any amount of money as a content producer, what you're selling is yourself. And it does make me wince to say that, because coming from doing a lot of Foucault studies, I don't love the idea of being an entrepreneur of the self. There's obviously a lot that is sort of unpleasant about that framing. But at the same time, there's also something that is kind of special about it. So I think that everybody who's engaging in this work, whether you're more on the producing side or more on the consuming side, but even if you're just doing like a little bit of commenting here and there, figuring out your own sweet spot for how much am I kind of expressing my feelings and my inwardness, maybe my indignation or my love for an idea, and how much am I just affirming the validity of the idea itself. Because if it goes too far in the direction of just expressing yourself, and in particular anger and indignation, these are the affective registers of the internet. If it goes too far in that direction, then I think it's likely just to resolve into more noise. And I guess as a final thought there, I used to be a little bit more virtuous in this regard and think, I don't want to put anything out there, whether I'm replying to somebody's tweet or Substack post, or if I've been invited onto a podcast. I don't want to put anything out there that feels like it's coming from like my heart or like me or my story. I'm not here to share my story. I'm here to share ideas. And I had come up with this line in my mind. But as I've gotten older, I realized that that line is completely artificial and it doesn't necessarily make for better thinking. There isn't actually something that's intrinsically more virtuous about doing it that way. But now I'm leaning in the direction where I worry that eventually, if I give too much of myself away, that I'll just be another noisemaker too.
Without a doubt, we live in an era of surplus provocation. There is no shortage. And I think because of that, we're trained on it. And our training towards surplus provocation forces us to preclude the value of things like measured criticism, methodological care, care for the speaker, care for the listener. And so I think, too, there's a connection between the value of a provocation, qua provocation, and the quick and inevitable disposability of anything that provokes. So to put it simply, if it's out there for shock value, it's going to dissipate as quickly as the shock does. And then in order to continue praying at this altar and cleaving to provocation as a singular value, you're forced, I think, in some sense, to tie this kind of ligature around these other important organs that compose us as not only philosophers, but as human beings. And so I think there is a virtue in a kind of subtlety, of course. And while you were talking, I was typing there. I apologize. I just pulled this up because I know I sent this to you, which was Reza Negarestani's critique of Nick Land. And actually, because of the event that we did, I emailed Reza about this. He's going to be on either Acid Horizon or Left Hand at some point, but it won't be for the Nick Land piece. And for those of you who are listening who've read it, maybe I'll even throw it in the show notes for this, because I think what Reza does there, although my including it in the show notes and mention of it here is not a complete endorsement of all of the views put forward by him, but I think there are so many important I mean, for lack of a better word, ideas about philosophy that he puts forward in such a simple and economical way in the piece that he wrote regarding his takedown of Nick Land that I think it's worth echoing here on this episode. And I'll just read one paragraph because I think it runs up directly against what we're talking about here. Maybe this will kind of like fold back into the creative process, the branding aspect of podcasts and philosophy itself. One of the risks that doing a podcast entails is not only are we in the attention economy, we're in the restricted economy of capitalism. And so there is a branding aspect, which I think also has if there is one trickle down effect in capitalism, it is that branding and the identification with philosophical ideologies as window dressings makes its way into social media as a way to build a kind of social capital there. And I have to admit, that's part of the way that I put the Acid Horizon podcast out there was through a series of images of the tarot cards that I created of various philosophers. And they tracked really well. They did really well in the Twitter and Instagram algorithms. And it helped me build the following that was Acid Horizon and brought attention to our podcast. But of course, that also engenders the risk of, for example, being typecast in a certain way. And that we're only going to do this kind of philosophy and that we're just going to settle into this sort of ideological ghetto. And I don't know what perceptions of those who don't listen to the podcast but only know us through our social media truly think. It's easy to demonize somebody on the basis of a tweet or some sort of meme that they threw out there. But I would say just as a matter of internal critique, but also as a kind of personal necessity of like, I want to do philosophy at the end of the day, and I don't want to be sort of trapped in the attention economy aspect of it. I think one of the things that I have forcefully done with myself is like knowing when to back out or interrupt that tendency to get caught up in the reactive loop of online culture. And of course, we all have our lapses with it. But I think one of the things that Reza states in his essay, Rational and Humanism versus Landian Anti-Philosophy, is something that rings true and something worth hearing and worth truly internalizing. He writes, if philosophy is packaged as a showroom of lifestyles, then Land's work becomes another option on the shelf. One chooses between rationalism and anti-rationalism, between humanism and anti-humanism, between the spaces of reasons and the abyss of time. But philosophy is not a retail aisle for positions, even when institutions try to domesticate it into one. It remains the name, generic but not empty, for a specific task, a stubborn resistance to the recoding of thought as identity, posture, tribe, and consumable temperament. It refuses the shelving of ideas into right and left, academic and anti-academic, critical and post-critical, as if the point were merely to pick a shelf and inhabit it. And I think there are extended implications for that idea, and some of them we've already talked about here today. And I think in terms of the kind of philosophy that I want to do going forward is sort of extricating oneself from that dynamic, that sort of centrifuge of, I guess you would say, semiocapital, signaling certain ideas, signaling certain takes. Granted, this doesn't mean that I'm not committed to certain things, of course, not committed to certain ideas, or that I hold a certain set of concepts as a foundation for my thinking, but without interrupting the uptake of philosophy into that sort of branding mentality, then you deprive yourself of the opportunity of the very sort of subtle ways that philosophy can operate within you and the way that it generates certain kind of intuitions and questions and skepticisms about ideas that you hold, or even entertain certain kinds of thought experiments that would put your philosophical identity into crisis in a good way. And I think that's one of the things that Reza's signaling in that essay that I think is worthwhile considering.
Yeah, fantastic excerpt from a fantastic essay. I want to print that excerpt out and right above my computer. One of the worst things that the internet has done to philosophy is force this topicality onto it to really make people think in terms of subheadings and takes and quick takeaways. But at the same time, what technology taketh away, it also giveth. So in corners of the internet, you get this overweening retail aisle approach to philosophy. However, in other corners, Discord servers, podcasts, and the communities around them, they have turned into containers for the sort of thinking that, unfortunately, academia no longer seems capable of sustaining, at least not in the way that it could in better times, perhaps. And that's not to say that it's completely gone out of the academy, but really the way to do philosophy is to have some sort of container that holds people back from taking the retail aisle approach and really creates the conditions for them to have philosophy kind of live inside them in this way that you describe. And it's something you have to fight for in this day and age because it is not the norm. I worry about people only discovering philosophy through memes or through certain social media sites and getting this extremely shallow understanding of what it's about. And I'm happy that there are people and initiatives out there trying to hold fast to the better parts of what it can and should be.
Yeah, that makes me think of the line from Mark Fisher that people want Nietzsche in the same way that they think they can have a cheeseburger, that it's something that's instantly consumable. And I just think about, for example, the 10 years plus, 15 years plus that I've been focusing on the work of Deleuze specifically, and that I've been over the passage 10 to 20 times. But then you come back to it like 6 months later and you see something that was on the page the whole time, and now it's speaking to you in a different way. And in that sense, the text and the encounter that I've staged with it becomes like a kind of incubator. And that's the one thing that many of us are desperate to find, I think, is, I mean, for us, a philosophical incubator, like you're talking about, a place where an idea can be cultivated, where a certain amount of pressure, maybe a better word is like an alchemical retort, right? That there's many different processes and the prima materia is worked over and over again in different ways. And the paltry substitute is the online space. And we get sucked into the philosophy doom scrolling. Like right now, there's the whole Twitter debacle about Western Marxism. If you don't know about that right now, Emma, please do not go on Twitter right now. Save yourself.
I'm all too aware.
It's on Substack too.
Yeah,
I saw
the Rock Hill book. And
gosh, anyway, it's just an absolute mess. Just going back to the point about philosophical incubation and the phrase like a spiritual incubation, in the sense that we want philosophy to do something to us, to affect us in a certain way. And it's hard to do that without cultivating some sort of space, some sort of community, some sort of practice, some sort of regularity to what we do. And we're already up against the obstacles of paying rent and doing however many shifts the boss wants us to do. But with that said, before we sign off for today, can you tell us a little bit about what the students who have already enrolled for your class, Asset Communism, A World Which Could Be Free, what are they going to experience starting, what is it, January 7th, right?
It's actually January 6th. So just on
January 6th.
Yep,
Okay.
Tuesday, January 6th. It's running every Tuesday in January. It's 4 weeks. My main hope, and something I'm going to tell the students explicitly, is to create this shelter, this container. So, of course, I'm preparing my lectures and I've got prompts for the discussion, and it will follow a somewhat familiar format of having a little bit of lecture and then some discussion. But everything that I'm doing, all of the notes that I'm taking, everything I'm preparing is done with this idea of creating a community among the participants and making them feel comfortable generating ideas of their own and connecting with fellow participants through the medium of the material. So as I will tell them, as I've already told them in my first announcement, and I'll keep saying, I'm really less interested in making sure that everyone's done every single page of the reading. And actually, frankly, as much or as little time as they can put into it is okay with me as the instructor. But what I have on the syllabus, I think, is really, really rich in terms of interpretive breadth. So people can connect their own life story to it, their creative practice to it, as well as any prior philosophical interests. And I want the course to be the seed for ideas and encounters that couldn't have taken place if it weren't for that particular container. And a lot of that is going to be a function of who shows up. Now, I've seen some of the people who have enrolled, and I'm familiar with some of them just because I know their work through different online spaces. And I'm really, really excited about just the range of students we already have enrolled. There are computer scientists, there are artists, there are scholars, there are people who I think are very, very new to this sort of thing, as well as people who have been doing it for years. And I'm going to just be kind of directing the alchemy. But so even though I'm excited to share some of my own thoughts on the material, it's really going to be about thinking as a collective. And actually, that is so appropriate for what acid communism as an idea was all about. I mean, it's a multidimensional idea, but the idea of doing scholarship as a collective instead of as the sort of great man approach to thinking about philosophy is very much consistent with Fisher's vision for acid communism, thinking with multiple minds. And that's another thing that we haven't really addressed, and I don't think we have the time for today, that I'm very excited about participating in, is spaces where people are less concerned with working as an individual author or thinker, but creating things as a collective. So I'm really excited for what is going to end up surprising me in addition to all of the stuff that I have prepared.
Yeah, exciting stuff. And I think this is a great way to inaugurate the AHRC in 2026. And I'll just say, too, we have many offerings at Acid Horizon and Left Hand. We're doing a Deleuze Logic of Sense reading group. If you're a patron on Acid Horizon, the $5 a month creates enough of a firewall to keep out some of the trolls and things like that, and just to kind of keep the community intact. And one of the things that I've just wanted to do that is just create a sense of consistency and community in those reading groups, which I think we've been very successful at over the many years that we've been doing this. But also with the AHRC, these will be the intensive engagements. And one of the things that I've wanted to do is, like I said, share this platform in a way that you can go to other para-academic schools, and teachers need to get paid to do the things that they are going to do for us. But I've wanted to do it in a way that's completely accessible. We'll have some scholarships available. Those will be coming very soon, but we've kept the price low, and I've wanted to pay the teachers very well in comparison to what I've heard at other institutions, just to make it a sustainable endeavor, and so that the teachers can walk away thinking like, hey, that was a good investment of my time, and the same for students as well. So I'll also say that Emma's class has been popular, and there might only be 10 seats left because we're capping it at 35 or thereabouts. So if you're interested, please act soon. And Emma, thanks for joining us today. And we're going to see you again a little bit later this month when we interview Aragorn Elof, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. Really look forward to everything that we'll create together.